Welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. As you may have noticed, I am not Timmy. I'm Jason Demora, and yes, I'm back. I guess my message on Romans 9 must have been somewhat okay because he invited me back, which is just fabulous. And I'm happy to be talking to you guys today about Romans 11, 1 through 24. And before we get into that, I'm just going to let you guys know that we're going to be doing a lot of cross references with the story of Elijah, which takes place from 1 Kings 17 through 19. Just take that into account, maybe have those both up, and we're going to get cracking. So let's read Romans 11, 1 through 24. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time there is a remnant, chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespasses, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I am speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as firstfruits is holy, so is the whole lump, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who supports the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I may be grafted in. That is true, they were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you are cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Now, if you're terribly confused, then you're in the same boat as I. When I first read this, super confused, I texted Timmy, this is crazy, why have you given me this? But let me tell you, I figured it out, or at least I think I figured it out, and we're going to be able to go through this, and I'm going to be able to explain this to you guys so you can understand what the heck Paul is talking about here. But first, let's go into prayer. Dear Lord, just give me the strength to be able to open up this message to these people, Lord, so that what you want me to say is said, Lord, so that we can learn your message both to the Gentiles and to the Israelites. Your message about that you keep your promises, Lord, and that you have mercy to many people, Lord, and that your mercy is shown and your judgment is shown, Lord, and that in your severity and in your kindness there is glory, Lord. I just pray that we would be able to learn from this passage. Amen. So, as I said, we're going to be quoting a lot of Elijah, because I feel that Paul quotes him once. I feel there's a lot of connections. So we're going to be quoting Elijah a lot. So before we get into this chapter, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on Elijah. All right, so Solomon commits evil, and the kingdom of Israel is split into two. We have the northern kingdom, and we have Judah. We have Israel and Judah. The king of Israel, the first one, is this guy named Jeroboam, and he's evil. He's incredibly, incredibly wicked. And every king that comes after him in Israel is also wicked. And it says of them that they were evil just like Jeroboam or worse than Jeroboam. And so you have king after king after king of these evil guys. And then we get to King Ahab. And in 1 Kings 16:31, it reads, And as it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam and the son of Nebat. Basically, it was easy for Ahab to be as evil as Jeroboam because he was just so evil. This king is just a terrible guy, and this is currently the king of Israel. Then Elijah shows up, and we have this reprise in the middle of Kings, which is full of judgment. We have a Bible hero. We have God's compassion, his mercy, his power. It's a good day. And he comes and he prays for a drought to come upon Israel, and then he goes into hiding in the wilderness because Ahab's wife, Jezebel, who is not of Israel, so he made a mistake there, shouldn't have married someone who's not of Israel, and is even more sinful than Ahab, is trying to hunt Elijah down. So he goes into the wilderness, and the first thing he does is he goes and lives at this woman's home who's not of Israel. So in Old Testament terminology, she has a location and a name, which we'll get into. But for us, it's important to understand that in New Testament terminology, she's a Gentile. She is not of Israel. So he goes and lives there. He then comes out of hiding, and he has the battle on Mount Carmel between him and the prophets. And fire comes down from heaven and lights his altar, showing that the God of the Israelites is the God. It looks like everything's going to go great, but Jezebel says, no, we're going to go kill Elijah. So Elijah runs for his life again and meets God on Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Elijah is told about the coming judgment upon Israel and of the remnant of Israel. So there you go, quick recap of Elijah. I know it was a lot, but we are going to go back into this, and we're going to focus on that last part right now, that remnant. So as we go back to Romans 11, we're going to be doing 2 points. We're going to be talking about Israel, the remnant, and then we're going to be talking about the Gentiles, which are the inclusion. Israel, the remnant, and the Gentile inclusion. So verses 1 through 10, we're going to be looking at the remnant, which is of Israel. So going to start reading this again. It says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. So here Paul's responding to something, and so we need to understand what happened the chapters before. So if you remember in Romans 9, quick synopsis, basically, God saves who he saves. That's basically it. He's sovereign, he saves who he saves. And then chapter 10, Israel is given the gospel and they reject it. So what's going on here is he's trying to make this argument saying that the fact that Israel isn't all saved doesn't mean that God doesn't keep his promises. Because if you remember, there was a promise given to Abraham, but it seems like it's not coming true. But what Paul is saying is, no, it is coming true because God saves who he saves, and he has given the gospel to Israel. They just didn't listen. And so now our argument here is that there is a remnant. By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, Paul, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Basically, he's placing himself as an example. Well, I'm an Israelite, so obviously he's saying some of the Israelites. He hasn't cursed all of them because I am an Israelite. And then he talks about Elijah, which we're going to go into. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew, the Israelites, his chosen people. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. So this happens at the end of those 3 chapters, 17 through 19. He has gone, he's had the battle with the prophets of Baal, he's killed 450 of them, he's shown the power of God, and he comes down, and Jezebel says, I'm going to hunt you down and try to kill you, and he runs into the wilderness afraid, and he meets God, and I think this is just an incredible story that really highlights what he's trying to talk about here. So let me find these verses for you guys real quick. All right, 1 Kings 19:10 is the first time that it is quoted where it says, Elijah said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. This is a complaint to the Lord. This is saying that I've tried so hard. I've tried to give the message to the Israelites. I've tried. I've brought fire down heaven. I caused a drought to come upon Israel. I tried, but they're not. They're not believing. And that's what Paul is talking about here in the earlier chapters, is that the Israelites are not believing. They get the gospel, they are not believing, and Elijah's unhappy. He's supposed to be this great prophet, and it's just not working. And then God presents himself. And he said, the Lord, Go out and stand on the mount before Yahweh. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Yahweh was not in the fire. These are the power of the Lord. We have earthquakes and fire and wind. This is what we usually expect to see God in his judgment against Israel. What Elijah is wanting is for judgment to come and to happen upon these evil people so that they may see God and they may repent. But God's not doing that. And it says, and after the earthquake of fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire, and after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Basically, the two things that we can get out of this is first that God is in control, even when you're not watching. Even when you don't think he's there, he is in control. So when we think about Israel and about how they're not listening to the gospel, as Paul is saying, it's important to understand that he is in control and he cares about his people. And the fact that he's not super presenting himself and causing fire for heaven doesn't mean that he's not there. It just means that he's in the gentle breeze, and you have to listen and look for where the Lord is working. And the second thing that I think is shown here is that there's power in the mercy and the patience of God that is shown when he comes gently and kindly. And that's what causes Elijah to go, whoa, this is a mighty God, for he is merciful and patient. And jumping back to Paul, Paul is saying here is that yes, Israel has turned to sin. They have rejected the gospel, and many of them are not believing. But God, their God, Yahweh, still cares for them, still will have peace and mercy on them, as we'll see further. And then, what I find interesting about what Paul is quoting here in Elijah is that it actually can apply to two verses. I read one of them, 10, and now I'm going to read the other one, which happens right after this demonstration of God's power. He said, Elijah, I have been very jealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And I think some commentaries say that this is not true, that this is still the same Elijah, and that's why it's quoted. But I think this is a different Elijah. This is an Elijah who has seen, oh, God is in control. He cares for Israel. He is there for them. He will show mercy upon them. And so, I'm ready. Take me. Do what you will with me. I know I'm the only one left, but I'm ready. I'm ready to do what the Lord commands me so that I can go share the gospel to the Israelites and so that some can be saved. So jumping back to Romans 11, what we can see from here is that the idea that God is there for Israel, that it's a few, it's not very many, it is this remnant, but God is there for them. And then we have this question of why? Why is it so small? And before we get into that, we notice, I forgot to mention this, is that there's another quote from Elijah, verse 4. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And this is saying, as I just said earlier, that there is a remnant. There is people in Israel who are still serving the Lord. And Elijah didn't even know they existed, but they are there. What was going on in that time is tons and tons of Baal worship, and they're there. The remnant of Israel is there, and they are worshiping the Lord. They are small, and that raises the question, why? Why is it only 7,000? There are tons of people in Israel worshiping Baal, but why is it only 7,000 that are worshiping the Lord? And this brings up the question that can be answered by two things, and we'll see it in Romans 11. So the first one is seen in verse 6. But it is by grace. It is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. In Paul's time, what the Israelites were struggling with was legalism. In Elijah's time, they were struggling with Baal worship. We'll get to Baal worship in a minute, but we got to talk about legalism, and this verse addresses it. Is that in Paul's time, the Israelites, the Jewish people, were not part of the remnant Because they were doing legalism, this idea of it's by works. If I do enough good things, if I do this task and this task, then God will like me, and judging people who don't do that, and we can't let the Gentiles in, and so on and so forth. And that is most obviously seen in the Pharisees. And what he's saying here is, no, it's by grace. So because they don't realize it's by grace, that's the first reason why they are not. The remnant is so small. The second reason is the hardening of the heart. And it says in 7, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. See, the Pharisees are looking for religion. They are looking for this communion with God. They're just looking in the wrong place. They're looking for the wrong reasons, and so they never get it. The elect obtained it, those who sovereignly are chosen before time. But the rest were hardened, as is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. These verses are quoted from Isaiah. We have one from Deuteronomy. We also have one from Psalms. All throughout the Bible showing this idea of the hardening of the heart. And last time I was on here, we talked about this. If you actually want to go listen to that message, it's a great message. I gave it, I would know. Talking about the hardening of the heart and the idea that God hardens people's hearts, and that doesn't mean he's causing them to not believe. He's allowing them to dwell in the unbelief they already have, and then allowing them to strengthen their unbelief. This idea that they're able to go more and more into unbelief. And this is the basis of legalism, is that they are doing that unbelief. And I think we get a great example of this in 1 Kings with Elijah. So jumping to 1 Kings 18:24. I know, crazy, we're going backwards with the story of Elijah, but it's going to be okay. 18:24 is in the middle of the battle between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. Basically what's going on is Elijah showed up, and he's going to show the prophets of Baal that his God, Yahweh, is on top and Baal is not. And so they each put up some altars, and he sets some ground rules. Imagine this is like a basic basketball match, and there's some ground rules. This is the rule, and we see it in verse 24. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of Yahweh, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. I mean, this logically makes sense. If fire comes down and consumes the altar of Baal, then Baal is God. If fire comes down and consumes the altar of Yahweh, then Yahweh is God. I mean, that logically makes sense. Now, it's important to understand Elijah is not saying, I'll believe in Baal, because he has a strong enough faith to know that fire will never come down from heaven upon Baal's altar. But he is trying to make this logical argument, like, guys, if your God's not answering you, then stop listening to him. But they don't believe. And we have this story, and at the end of the story, there is this answer, the response. In 1839, after fire comes from heaven and discovers a water-filled altar that Elijah had created, and it is shown so clearly that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is God. It says, and when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. It's looking great. It's looking like the people of Israel are going to turn and repent, and the Baal worship's going to end, and everything is going to go back to the way it should be, and it's going to be great. But it doesn't. And in verse 19:2, Jezebel walks in and says, no, I will not allow this. See, Jezebel saw this. She saw what went on. She saw the message. She saw the fire come down from heaven. Maybe not actually, but she got the message. She knows that 450 prophets were killed, and this is her response. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods, lowercase g, do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, the prophets who were killed, by this time tomorrow. Now, to me, this seems a little funny, because wasn't it just proven by the rules of that game that those prophets are not real and they're not going to do anything? And Elijah even mocks them and says, are you in the bathroom? Are you on a business trip? Are you sleeping? Those gods aren't going to do anything. They're not going to help hunt down Elijah. They're not going to protect Elijah. They're not going to kill Jezebel if she fails to get Elijah. It's not going to happen. And this is the silliness of unbelief and the hardening of the heart. That you can see fire come down from heaven and go, no, I refuse to believe. I refuse to believe. And this is Israel. And this is a perfect example of, because this is the chosen people. These aren't some Gentile people. These are the people of Israel who saw the fire, said, this is God, and chose to not believe. For their hearts were hardened and they turned away. So that is why the remnant is so small. It's because in Paul's era, specifically, they're struggling with legalism. But generally, it is this idea of the hardening of the heart of the unbeliever, that no matter how great the miracle, they will always not believe because their hearts are hardened sovereignly by God, and also the fact that they just don't want to believe. Naturally, humans do not want to believe. They do not want to go and worship the Lord. So that is the remnant, and that is the message mainly to Israel and mainly to the people of Israel. But what it teaches generally is this idea that God keeps his promises. See, I'm not an Israelite. I'm not Jewish. I am of a Gentile, and the second half is really going to apply more to the Gentiles and to the ones who are not Jewish and listening to this message. But when we hear this first half, it's important to understand that God keeps his promises and he will go and save Israel. But at the moment, their hearts are being hardened, but there is a remnant. May they be small. There is a remnant of Israel that is standing strong. And at the end of times, as we'll learn in Timmy's message next week, they will be a miraculous moment at the end of times where a huge amount of Israelites are saved. And so God does keep his promises. The promise given to Abraham will come true. All right, let's jump to the Gentile inclusion, which is the second half of this passage. So the first thing we see here, and it's kind of confusing, and it still kind of confused me, but it's this idea of jealousy. And jealousy sounds like a bad thing. So it causes you to wonder, how does this make any sense? But we're going to figure it out. So verse 11 says, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? This is saying, did Israel sin in order that they may never be saved and their entire nation be cursed and all Israelites throughout all time be cursed? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, rejecting Christ and not believing in him, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Basically, it's this idea that the Israelites are not believing, so we're going to turn to the Gentiles, the non-chosen people. And when we get into this section, it is incredibly important to understand that the Gentiles are not the people of God. The Gentiles are not. They are not of the chosen people ethnically. They are not of the original chosen people, and that's very important to understand. So we're going to turn to the Gentiles. We're going to give them the gospel so that Israel, the chosen people, may see what's going on. Why are they getting saved and become jealous? So let's turn back to 1 Kings, and let's see an example of this with Elijah. 1 Kings 18. This is the first time Elijah shows up. Elijah shows up, and the first thing he does is he causes this hero prophet who's supposed to be for Israel. The first thing he does is causes a 3.5 year drought to come upon Israel. It's not looking good for Israel. And then the second thing he does, which is quite fascinating, is he goes and he lives at this woman's house who is outside of Israel. And that verse can be found, one moment, in 1 Kings 17:9. 1 Kings 17:9 says, or 8, then the word of the Lord came to him, to Elijah, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So I don't know where Zarephath is, and I don't know where Sidon is, but I know it's not in Israel. These are not the chosen people. This is a widow who, and it actually is made clear, I did some study, is in the land where Baal worship is even greater than it is in Israel. So, totally not Israel. Israel has been rejected. Elijah is going to a Gentile woman. And what happens at her house is just miraculous. First, there is a miracle done where in the middle of the drought, this widow woman who doesn't have a man in the house to go out and provide for the family, her food is doubled and doubled and doubled, and there's this like magical bowl that continues to give food, and it continues to give food because God is caring for them. And then her son dies. Her son dies, and she goes, Elijah, what have you done? Like, why did you come here? You killed my son. And then Elijah goes and raises him from the dead. Or actually, to make it more accurate, he prays and God raises him from the dead. This is different than what the disciples did in the New Testament. He prayed and the son rose from the dead. And so we have two physical miracles that are done here to this Gentile woman, which are tons of food and the raising of her son from the dead. But the miracle that I see that is greater than these is the spiritual miracle, which is seen in verse 24, which reads, "And the woman said to Elijah after seeing these miracles, 'Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth.'" To me, that's a verse of salvation. This woman has believed. So we often look at Elijah and we look at the middle chapter of God versus Baal on Mount Carmel, and we go, yeah, Elijah is turning the people of Israel. But we forget that it's sandwiched by a chapter that's focusing on how a Gentile woman and a chapter that's focusing on how Israel will be judged, which we'll get to more in a moment. Basically, Israel has been rejected at this moment, and Elijah, this great prophet, who, fun fact, is in the transfiguration of Jesus in the New Testament, he's this incredible guy, is turning to the Gentiles first. And in this moment, me even reading this, it causes you to go like, what happened to Israel? Why has he turned? And I think it applies to this idea of jealousy, that we can go that God has turned away from his chosen people to save the Gentiles so that Israel might go, oh man, we need to turn because the Gentiles have something that we have lost. And I can even imagine, it's not quoted anywhere in the Bible, but New Testament scholars going back and reading Kings and reading about their nation and reading this chapter and going, Elijah, what are you doing? Why are you going to this sinful woman who probably worships Baal and going to her? This doesn't make sense. Go save Israel. But he doesn't. He goes to the Gentile woman. And the reason being, and the reason why the Gentiles are served by Paul in the New Testament and other cases all throughout the Old Testament as well, is to show, firstly, that God does extend his message to the Gentiles, but also to make Israel jealous, and so that they may see that they have been doing it wrong in a sense. And it goes on. Now, if their trespass, their sinning, Israel's trespasses, means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? What this is not saying is that all of Israel will be saved. This is not what it's saying. I do believe that this is alluding to the second half of this chapter, which is talking about the miracle at the end of times where there is a revelation to the Israelites and a ton of them are saved. Because it is true that there are going to be a ton of Israelites saved, and there have been a ton of Israelites saved. That is true. And so he's saying here that if those Israelites are eventually saved, and Gentiles watch that, and they see that God keeps his promises, maybe even more Gentiles would be saved. So what God's doing is he's showing this redemptive plan, and I mean that's literally the Bible, is the Old Testament into Jesus' coming, is the resurrection, the redemption story of Israel. Tons and tons of sinning. We see this all throughout 1 Kings, and it keeps going, and it was going, and then it leads to Jesus comes. And there is a chance for salvation for Israel. And that redemption story is shown to the Gentiles, and they go, whoa, God keeps his promises. God has extended this message to us. Let's believe. And then to the Israelites, we have this sense of jealousy that they go, we want that. We have been doing this wrong. We've been resting in legalism. We've been resting in Baal worship. We need to turn to Christ. Verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, and here, as we go into 13, it's warned again that it gets more personal, and I like this portion. It says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, as much then as that I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, Paul speaking, in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. See, Paul is a Jew, and he cares for his people, and he wants his people to hear the gospel. And so that is one of the reasons why he's going to the Gentiles. because he realizes that they're not listening. So he's going to go find someone who will listen so that maybe the Jews will also listen. And we know the story of Paul where he goes back to Jerusalem and it doesn't go well. They all hate him. They go, "Why have you preached to the Gentiles? You've done it wrong. They are dirty, disgusting people." And it's actually them. It's actually the Jews who are the dirty, disgusting people because they have seen Jesus. They have seen fire come from heaven and they have not believed. For the rejection, once again talking about Israel, really just repeating himself. The rejection means the reconciliation of the world. What would their acceptance mean? But life from the dead. Same idea is that if they believe in this redemption story, that we can see salvation. And then this last verse is very important. If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. What he's saying here, and he's reminding the Gentiles before he gets into his next argument, is that the Gentiles are not the chosen people and the Israelites are. No matter if they don't believe or they do believe, the Israelites are the chosen people. They get a book, the Gentiles do not. The Israelites have the Old Testament, which is their story, their redemptive arc, even though, as we know, many of them did not believe. But the point is that they are the chosen people. They are going to have that event at the end of times where many of them are saved. And it is important to understand that they are the chosen people. The Gentiles are not, which gives glory to God in when the Gentiles realize how great a mercy it is, how great we realize how great a mercy is that we've been allowed to hear this message and join in with the chosen people, and not ethnically, but spiritually be part of the chosen people. And then he goes on to this, talking about really focusing on this idea that you are not the chosen people, as I just said, and then it goes on to talk about this in verse 17 through 24. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are remembered, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Okay, what is going on? So I am not a plant person. I have no idea how grafting works or growing things works. I am a dude, and that's just not something I do. But basically, imagine my hands are plants. So this one is the olive tree, and this one's the wild olive tree. This is the nice, amazing olive tree. This is the olive tree no one likes. What he's going to talk about is this argument that some of branches of the olive tree do not believe. This is the Israel, do not believe. And so that some from the wild olive tree who also are not part of the chosen people may stop not believing and start believing, be grafted in, which is where you take one plant and add it to the other plant, so like this, and then they're grafted in so that now they are believing and are part of the chosen people. All right, there's Jason's attempt at trying to teach grafting. You can look it up if you want, but yeah, that's basically what he's talking about, is this idea that we have wild olive branch and nice olive branch, and some wild ones are added to the nice ones, and some of the nice ones are cut off. So, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are remembered, it's not you who support the root supports you. So verse 17 and 18 are reminding the Gentiles, you are not the chosen people. Do not be like, oh, I'm so cool. I was added. I'm better than the Israelites. I mean, they were literally shown so much stuff and they didn't believe. And I am better than them because I didn't really see very much, but I do believe. This is great. Because they're not the chosen people, the Israelites are. So rather they should go, wow, how great this is that the message was shared so that I could hear, so that I could be part of the chosen people. And then it goes on, then you will say, branches were broken off so that I may be grafted in. All right, this is a confusion between what's called causation and correlation. Basically what he's saying is that if two Israelites do not believe, and two Gentiles do believe, then it means that the non-belief of the Israels causes the belief of the Gentiles. That's causation. That's wrong. What it is correlation. The Israelites, some don't believe, and some of the Gentiles, they do believe. It happens about the same time, but it doesn't mean that there's any one causing the other. It's called correlation. They happen around the same time. They seem to be causing each other, but they're not. If you look at Christianity that way and salvation that way, then you are terribly flawed and you're doing it wrong. And it's very important as a Gentile to not think that God has cursed the Israelites so that we may believe. No. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through your own faith. So do not become proud, but fear. This idea that, as I just said, that it's not their unbelief has nothing to do with your belief. The only thing that comes together is that idea of jealousy, which we talked before, is that if some Israelites don't believe and then the Gentiles do believe and then Israel sees that and goes, we want that, we're going to start believing. But make sure, and I know we just talked about Israels and Gentiles and this and that, and this applies to Paul, but we can take this more generally and understand that somebody else's unbelief does not mean your belief. Somebody else's evil does not mean you're in the good. That is not how it works. It's about you and your relationship with God and your faith. That's it. It is great to be in communion with other Christians and to not be a murderer, but if your friend murders someone, that doesn't mean you're a great guy. It's not how it works. And I mean, if we go to the Pharisees, that's what they try to do. They try to shun other people and say, we're not like the tax collector. We must be good. That's not how it works. Absolutely not. Never think of it that way. It is 100% by your faith and your faith alone. And then it says, lost my spot. That is true. They were broken off. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. For this, we're going to turn back to 1 Kings. And we're going to turn back to chapter 19, the last chapter. So we actually skipped, and Paul skips a little bit. He goes from God's revelation and then Elijah's conviction right to the remnant. But before Elijah's told about the remnant, the 7,000 people who are believing, there's judgment. We're still in we're still in Kings, so there's going to be judgment. And it reads, I got to find this, give me half a second. First Kings 19:15. And the Lord said to him, to Elijah, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint these three people. Anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. Wow, that's hard to say. And the one who escapes, this is where it gets important, and the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. There is judgment upon those who do not believe in Israel. We're talking about the Israelites here. There is judgment upon them. So I can't go through all of the verses, but there is one that we've got to talk about. We've got to talk about Hazael. So we're going to jump to 2 Kings 8:12, which is going to take me half a second because I lost my spot. 2 Kings 8:12 to read about Hazael, this king who is anointed by Elisha, Elijah's predecessor, to judge Israel because they have sinned. Elijah 8:12. So Elisha anoints Hazael, and Hazael said, and Hazael said, why does my Lord weep? Why is Elisha weeping? And Elisha answers, because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young men with the sword, and dash in pieces their little ones, and rip open their pregnant women. This is not judgment from some king who's not under the power of God. This is Hazael of Syria, who is anointed through Elisha by the power of God to enact judgment upon Israel. And I feel like we read these things in Kings and feel bad for these people, but remember, these are sinners, these are Baal worshipers, these are evil people. Of Jehu, he takes all of the prophets and he brings them to a Baal convention where they all come in to go worship Baal but it's a trick. Every one of them who walks out is slaughtered. And we have Elisha, who is recorded of praying for droughts and destruction of the people of Israel. That's literally his role, is to pray for judgment so that it may come from the Lord. There is judgment that's coming upon Israel. So what does this mean to the Gentile? If God's willing to show that much judgment on his chosen people, the people who he loves, who he gave a promise to through Abraham and the forefathers, who he has recorded in the Bible throughout the Old Testament, what will he do to the Gentiles? Those outsiders who are allowed in by the mercy of God. Do not think for a moment that he will not enact the same judgment, for he will. And that judgment will come. He will come in and destroy the fortresses and kill the young men and kill the women and children, because that is the just power of God. And I think Paul's point here, and Timmy's going to talk more about it next week, is that, and it's talked throughout the Old Testament, is there's really no difference between the Jews and the Greeks. There's difference in if they're ethnically the chosen people or not, and there's difference in culture, and there's difference in that. But when it comes down to salvation, there's no difference. Romans 10:12, which he talked about last week, says that very clearly. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, the Gentile and the Jew. And the judgment is the same for the Gentile and the Jew. The destruction that will come and the eternal damnation that comes upon those who do not believe is the same for the Gentile and the Jew. But the last thing that's important is, yes, there is this sameness between them, but it is also important to understand that Israel is the chosen nation. It is the chosen people, and I would say that God has a greater love for that people, and he will keep his promise, and he will save Israel, and there is a remnant of Israel who will turn to him and serve him. And it goes on to say basically the same things that note then the kindness and the severity of God, severity towards those who have fallen. This is not talking about Gentile or Greek, but to both of them. There is severity, there is destruction, there is burning and fire and killing, all seen throughout 1 Kings and recorded in Revelations as well. But God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. So to the Gentile, this is more specifically talking to Gentile, is that his mercy has been extended. But if you don't accept it, you too will be judged and cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. This is talking to Israel. This is exactly what I just said. God keeps his promises and will save Israel and has a greater love for them, and there will be saving of them in the end of times. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Exactly what I was just saying. God cares for Israel. God keeps his promises. God is there for Israel, and he will, at the end of times, have a special moment where he will save many of them, and he has saved many of them in the past. So that brings us to the end of Romans 11, 1 through 24. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you guys next week. Or actually, Timmy will see you next week.